Hey there. If you're listening to this, you're probably here for two things: a little history and a lot of sleep. So go ahead, get cozy, dim the lights, pull that blanket up like you're hiding from your responsibilities, and maybe, just maybe, from a can of 1943 corned beef. Tonight we're talking about food, not the kind you order at midnight, the kind soldiers ate during World War II, when menus came in metal tins and hope was often the seasoning. So close your eyes. We're heading to muddy trenches, steaming mess halls, and the world's saddest chocolate bar. Because if war is hell, dinner was sometimes worse. Expectations versus reality. World War II soldiers. You picture them standing tall, brave, focused, cloaked in glory and maybe a thin layer of patriotic mud. And of course, well-fed. Right? I mean, surely the greatest armies in history wouldn't let millions of men fight on empty stomachs. Right? Well, about that. See, when most people imagine wartime meals, they think of something hearty. A steaming stew, a chunk of fresh bread, maybe a slice of apple pie if you're American, or just the memory of one. But the reality? The average World War II soldier's meal was less farm to table and more can to regret. The great feeding problem. Picture this. You're running the world's largest catering business. Your clients? About 15 million hungry soldiers scattered across 6 continents. Your kitchen? Non-existent. Your delivery trucks? They keep getting blown up. Oh, and your customers are armed. Very armed. And understandably cranky when dinner's late. This was the logistical puzzle that kept military quartermasters awake at night, staring at maps and wondering how exactly you ship fresh vegetables to a foxhole in Burma. Spoiler alert, you don't. Food wasn't just a meal, it was a problem. A logistical, emotional, and gastrointestinal nightmare. You had to feed millions of people across oceans, jungles, deserts, and snowy death traps. Without modern refrigeration, delivery apps, or even reliable spoons, everything had to survive months of transport in conditions that would make a food safety inspector weep. Think about it. That can of beans heading to the Pacific had to endure tropical heat, monsoon rains, freezing mountain passes, and the occasional torpedo. By the time it reached Private Johnson in his muddy hole somewhere in the Philippines, it had seen more of the world than most tourists. And flavor? That was optional. The hierarchy of military cuisine. There was a clear pecking order when it came to wartime dining, and it went something like this. Top tier. Officers in established headquarters. These lucky souls occasionally saw fresh meat, real bread, and, if the stars aligned, actual vegetables. Not often, mind you, but enough to remember what food was supposed to taste like. Middle tier. Regular troops in base camps. They got the good rations, the ones that came in boxes with cheerful labels and optimistic nutritional claims. Still terrible, but terrible with variety. Bottom tier, frontline soldiers. These poor bastards got whatever could be dropped from a plane, carried by mule, or smuggled past enemy lines. If it didn't come in a can that could double as a grenade, they probably weren't eating it. Rock bottom. Anyone trapped behind enemy lines, in a siege, or just having a particularly bad Tuesday. These soldiers developed an intimate relationship with hunger and learned to appreciate cuisine that would make a medieval peasant feel spoiled. Portability came first, shelf life came second, nutrition third, and taste? Well, taste was somewhere between whatever and please don't vomit. The science of edible survival. The military took nutrition seriously, in theory. They had scientists, charts, calorie calculations that looked impressive on paper. A soldier needed roughly 4,000 calories a day if he was going to march 20 miles with a 50-pound pack and then dig a hole to sleep in. But there's a difference between nutritionally adequate and something a human being would voluntarily put in their mouth. The result? Rations that could survive nuclear fallout, but not a Yelp review. These weren't meals. They were edible engineering projects. Each component was designed to solve a specific problem, won't spoil, won't freeze, won't attract insects, won't poison you, probably, and won't fall apart when dropped from a truck. Taste was what happened accidentally, if you were lucky. National approaches to military misery. Different countries tried different strategies, each reflecting their national character in the most depressing way possible. The Americans boxed their optimism in cardboard. They believed that with enough industrial efficiency and positive thinking, they could mass-produce decent food. They were wrong, but they were wrong with impressive enthusiasm. The British clung to tea like it was life support, which, let's be honest, it probably was. Everything else might taste like cardboard soaked in regret, but by God, the tea was hot and strong and reminded you of home. The Germans started strong and ended with mystery meat. Early in the war, they maintained decent field kitchens and even had mobile bakeries. By 1944, they were eating ersatz everything and pretending sawdust bread was character building. The Soviets had cabbage. So much cabbage. Cabbage soup, pickled cabbage, cabbage with other cabbage. If you were fighting on the Eastern Front, you were going to develop a relationship with cabbage, whether you wanted to or not. And the Japanese? They fought on rice balls and a terrifying amount of discipline. When you're facing death by starvation or death by enemy fire, rice balls start looking pretty good. The art of making do. Here's what the history books don't tell you. Soldiers became incredibly creative with their terrible food. When you're stuck with the same 5 cans for 3 months, you either learn to jazz them up or you go insane. Some mixed their coffee with cocoa powder to create what they generously called mocha. Others discovered that cheese spread could improve almost anything, including other cheese spread. The truly desperate learned that hot sauce could mask the taste of nearly any crime against cuisine. Cigarettes became currency, not just for trading but for cooking. A soldier might trade his dessert ration for cigarettes, then use those cigarettes to trade for someone else's meat course. It was like a stock market, except everything was overpriced and tasted terrible. Letters home were full of food fantasies. "When I get back, I'm going to eat a whole chicken," soldiers would write. And then another chicken. And maybe a pie. Definitely a pie. Actually, several pies. The cruel irony of war. Meanwhile, back home, civilians were dealing with their own food shortages. Rationing was the law of the land. Sugar was precious. Meat was scarce. Everyone was making do with less so that the soldiers could have, well, slightly better versions of making do with less. The home front was eating victory gardens while the soldiers were eating victory rations, and nobody was particularly victorious in the culinary sense. But here's the thing that gets overlooked. Soldiers weren't just fighting for their country or their ideals or their brothers in arms. They were fighting for the memory of real food, for Sunday dinners and birthday cakes and the simple pleasure of choosing what to eat. Nothing makes you appreciate a fresh tomato like 3 months of eating from a can labeled meat product unspecified. The waiting game. And then there were the times when there was no food at all. When supply lines were cut, or weather-prevented deliveries, or someone higher up the chain had made a miscalculation. These were the moments when soldiers learned that hunger isn't just an empty stomach. It's a hollowing out of everything that makes you feel human. They'd sit in their trenches or their bunkers or their temporary camps, listening to their stomachs compete with the sound of distant artillery. They'd tell stories about meals they'd eaten before the war, describing them with the kind of detail usually reserved for poetry or prayer. "My mother's pot roast," one soldier might say, and the entire unit would go quiet, lost in their own food memories. These weren't just conversations. They were survival strategies. If you couldn't fill your stomach, at least you could fill your imagination. The long view. So before we dive into the specifics, the K rations, D rations, trench soups, and hardtack heartbreaks, just remember, war might be hell, but hunger? That's the part nobody wrote songs about. Because hunger is mundane. It's not heroic or dramatic. It's just the slow, grinding reality of your body reminding you, meal after missed meal, that you're still human, still vulnerable, still dependent on something as basic and undignified as food. The soldiers of World War II didn't just fight with rifles and tanks and airplanes. They fought with empty stomachs and the determination to make it through to the next terrible meal. And somehow most of them did, but they never forgot what real food tasted like, or how much they'd taken it for granted. Some battles are won with bullets. Others are won with the simple act of not giving up when your dinner comes in a can labeled "Contents Food." The real victory? Making it home to complain about the food. A day in the life. What it was really like to eat in a war zone. Dawn in hell. You wake up, not to birdsong, not to the smell of pancakes or fresh coffee. You wake up to someone snoring through their helmet and the distant thud of something exploding where breakfast should be. Your bed? Damp ground. Your blanket? A wet coat and whatever regrets you packed the night before. You slept with your boots on because taking them off means finding out what cold, damp socks feel like at 5 a.m. Spoiler bad. The first thing you notice isn't the ache in your back or the fact that your rifle is digging into your ribs. It's the taste in your mouth. Stale cigarettes, fear, and something that might have been dinner but could just as easily have been a war crime against your taste buds. You stretch. Kinda. And immediately bump into 3 other guys doing the same thing in a hole barely big enough for 2. No privacy, no bathroom, just a trench, some mud, and the quiet realization that your spine is now permanently shaped like a question mark. Someone's always awake before you. There's always that one guy who seems to function on 3 hours of sleep in pure spite. He's already checking his rifle, counting his ammunition, and doing whatever mysterious things soldiers do when they think nobody's watching. Maybe he's praying. Maybe he's just staring into space, wondering how he ended up eating breakfast in a hole in the ground somewhere in France. The silence isn't really silence. There's always something. Distant engines, the crack of wood in the cold, someone coughing 3 foxholes over, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound your body makes when you're trying not to make any sounds at all. And then your stomach reminds you that it exists. It's not gentle about it. The breakfast ritual breakfast? Ah, yes, the most important meal of the day. Let's see what's on the menu. You pull out your K-ration breakfast box, which feels exactly like what it is. A cardboard brick filled with mild disappointment. The box is surprisingly sturdy, considering it's traveled halfway around the world to reach you. It's survived ship crossings, truck convoys, supply drops, and probably a few explosions. The cardboard has more combat experience than some recruits. Opening it is its own little ceremony. You peel back the wax paper lining with the care of someone defusing a bomb, partly because you don't want to waste any of the meager contents, and partly because you're putting off the inevitable moment when you have to actually eat what's inside. Inside, arranged with military precision, a tin of ham and eggs that tastes vaguely like meat and definitely like despair. The eggs are recognizable mainly by their yellow color, which exists independently of any flavor that might remind you of actual eggs. The ham is pink and salty and has the texture of something that gave up on being food long before it met you. Some rock-hard crackers that could survive atmospheric re-entry. These aren't crackers in any civilian sense. They're edible construction materials. You could probably build a small fort with them, which might be more useful than eating them. They require serious jaw commitment. Chewing them is a workout. Your teeth will ache for hours afterward. A packet of instant coffee so bitter it might be holding a grudge. The powder is brown, which is the most coffee-like thing about it. Mixed with whatever water you can find, usually lukewarm from your canteen and tasting faintly of metal and iodine tablets, it becomes something that contains caffeine and therefore serves its purpose. Barely. Powdered lemonade? Because why not ruin breakfast in 2 directions? Someone, somewhere, thought that adding artificial lemon flavor to this morning would somehow improve things. They were wrong. but you appreciate the optimism. 4 cigarettes. These might be the best part of the meal. Not because they taste good, though compared to everything else, they're practically gourmet, but because they give you something to do with your mouth that isn't chewing. 2 sticks of gum, cinnamon flavored, usually, which is aggressive and artificial and somehow comforting in its complete artificiality. At least it's honest about not being real food. And 1 sheet of toilet paper. Just 1. Use wisely. The art of field dining. You eat quickly or slowly. Depends on how motivated you are to chew through the ham. Speed has its advantages. Less time to think about what you're eating, less time for your taste buds to register their formal complaints. But eating slowly has its own logic. This might be the only quiet moment you get all day. Might's well make it last. There's no table, no chairs. You eat sitting on your helmet or leaning against a tree or crouched in whatever corner of your foxhole catches the least wind. Your plate is the lid of the tin can. Your knife is whatever you've managed to keep sharp, and your napkin is your sleeve. You wash it down with coffee stirred in a dented tin cup using your finger or a cleaned bayonet. No spoon. Never a spoon. Somewhere in the vast military bureaucracy, someone made a decision about spoons, and that decision was no. You adapt. You always adapt. The coffee is hot, which is more important than it being good. Heat is luxury. Heat is comfort. Heat is proof that you're still alive and still capable of making things marginally better for yourself. Other soldiers are doing the same thing around you. Nobody talks much during breakfast. There's not much to say about ham and eggs from a can. And besides, talking requires energy better saved for the day ahead. But there's comfort in the shared misery. Everyone's eating the same terrible food. Everyone's making the same faces. Everyone understands. Sometimes someone will make a joke. Just like Mother used to make, while struggling with a particularly stubborn cracker. If your mother hated you, someone else will respond. Brief laughter, then back to the serious business of consuming calories. The march to nowhere. Then it's off to work. And by work, we mean war. You march. You dig. You sweat. You try not to die. And you think occasionally about lunch. Marching on a stomach full of K-ration breakfast is its own special experience. The food sits there. A heavy reminder that you're carrying around several hundred calories of processed disappointment. It's fuel, technically. Your body converts it into energy eventually, but it's reluctant fuel, sullen fuel, fuel that would rather be doing something else. The rhythm of marching becomes hypnotic after a while. Left, right, left, right. Your pack bounces. Your rifle strap cuts into your shoulder. Your boots develop their own relationship with the ground. Sometimes cooperative, sometimes adversarial, always intimate. You march through villages that used to be villages, past fields that used to grow food, real food, vegetables and grain and things that grew in dirt instead of being manufactured in factories. You try not to think about it, but sometimes you catch yourself wondering what fresh bread would taste like, what a tomato would taste like, what anything that wasn't processed and preserved and designed to outlast you would taste like. The landscape changes, but your stomach doesn't. It's learned not to expect much. It's learned to be grateful for calories, regardless of their source or their willingness to cooperate with your digestive system. It's become philosophical about food, Zen even, but it still complains, quietly, persistently, like a polite protest that goes on for hours. Midday sustenance. When it's time, if you're lucky and not actively dodging artillery, you break open the next little cardboard miracle, your K-ration lunch. Finding time for lunch is its own tactical challenge. You need a moment when nobody's shooting at you, when you're not actively moving, when you can spare the mental energy required to operate a can opener. These moments are rarer than you'd think. When you do find the time, there's a brief ceremony involved. You find a relatively dry spot. You set down your rifle within easy reach. You check your surroundings because sitting still with food makes you vulnerable in ways that go beyond the obvious. Then you commit to the act of eating, which requires a certain faith that you'll be alive long enough to finish. The highlights include processed cheese spread, which is less cheese and more industrial adhesive. It comes in a small can that requires a special kind of violence to open. The cheese itself is orange, aggressively orange, unnaturally orange, orange that seems to glow with its own inner light. It spreads like paint and tastes like salt with a vague dairy theory. But it's protein, and protein is life, so you eat it. Another stack of jaw-breaking crackers. The same ones from breakfast, or maybe different ones that happen to be identical. They serve the same function. Edible structural engineering. You learn to soak them in coffee or water if you have time. This doesn't improve the taste, but it reduces the risk of dental damage. A chocolate bar so dense it could deflect small arms fire. Military chocolate is a triumph of preservation over pleasure. It's designed to survive extremes of temperature, humidity, and impact that would destroy civilian chocolate. The trade-off is that it tastes like chocolate-flavored concrete, but it's sweet technically, and sweetness is rare enough to be precious. More gum, more cigarettes. These are the constants, the reliable elements that show up in every meal. They're not food exactly, but they're sustenance of a different kind. Psychological sustenance. Proof that someone somewhere thinks you deserve small comforts. Still no spoon. The afternoon stretch. You eat quickly, crouched behind something vaguely protective. You drink from your canteen, which tastes like yesterday's iodine tablet and disappointment. The cheese spreads. The crackers crumble. The chocolate stays mostly solid, in both texture and emotional weight. You consume it all with the mechanical efficiency of someone who's learned that eating is a job that needs to be done, not an experience to be enjoyed. Your canteen water is its own adventure. It's been treated with chemicals to kill anything that might kill you. But those same chemicals give it a taste that's distinctly medicinal. Sometimes there's a metallic tang from the canteen itself. Sometimes there's a hint of whatever was in the water before it was treated. It's safe theoretically, but safety doesn't mean it's pleasant. By mid-afternoon, your stomach has stopped complaining. It knows better. You press on. This is when hunger becomes background noise. It's there, always there, but you learn to tune it out. Like the weight of your pack, or the ache in your feet, or the constant low-level anxiety that comes with being in a place where people are actively trying to kill you. It becomes part of the baseline of existence. You march or dig or wait or fight. You do whatever the day demands. And part of your brain is always calculating how many hours until dinner, how many calories left in your pack, how long can you keep going on what you've eaten? The answers are always the same. Not long enough, not many, and longer than you think you can. Evening's false promise. Evening arrives. If you can call less daylight and more cold a proper evening, you finally get to your K-ration dinner. And oh boy, dinner should be the reward for surviving another day. It should be the moment when you sit back, relax, and enjoy the fruits of your labor. In civilian life, dinner is social. It's comfortable. It's the meal where you have time to taste things. Military dinner is none of these things. It's fuel dispensed at the end of a long day when you're too tired to care what it tastes like and too hungry to be picky. It's sustenance delivered when your body needs it most and deserves it least. Inside the familiar cardboard prison, meat and beans which smell like something you once stepped in. The meat is identifiable mainly by its texture, soft, salty, and somehow both greasy and dry at the same time. The beans are more successful at being beans, but they're swimming in a sauce that tastes like someone described tomatoes to someone who had never seen a tomato. Crackers, again, of course. The same reliable, tooth-threatening crackers that have been your constant companion throughout the day. By dinner, you've developed a relationship with these crackers. It's not a good relationship, but it's a consistent one. A fruit bar that tastes like someone whispered apple at a block of wood. It's sweet technically and fruit-flavored theoretically. It's also dense enough to use as emergency building material. You eat it anyway, because sweetness is rare and vitamin C is supposedly important for reasons someone explained to you once. A paper packet of toilet tissue, which is somehow the most luxurious part of the meal. It's soft, it's clean, it has a purpose beyond being consumed. In a world where everything is designed to be eaten, having something that's designed for comfort is almost decadent. A matchbook. Fire is civilization, fire is warmth. Fire is the difference between cold food and slightly less cold food. The matches are precious and you hoard them like treasure. More gum. The constants continue, cinnamon or spearmint depending on the whims of military procurement. It's not food, but it's something to do with your mouth after the meal is over. And if the stars align, a tin of actual Hershey's chocolate, which, for a brief second, makes you believe in joy. Real chocolate, civilian chocolate. Chocolate that tastes like the chocolate you remember from before everything went wrong. It's a small miracle. A reminder that somewhere in the world, people are still making things that are designed to be enjoyed rather than endured. You save it for last. You eat it slowly. You let it melt on your tongue and try to remember what pleasure feels like. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, you're not a soldier eating from a can in a hole in the ground. You're just a person enjoying chocolate. Then it's gone, and you're back to being a soldier, but the memory lingers. The evening ritual. You eat it cold or heated over a tiny fire made with matches and wishful thinking. You huddle with others. You talk about home, about food you actually remember liking, about restaurants and diners that served things like flavor. If you're lucky, someone's managed to get a fire going. Not a big fire. Big fires attract attention, and attention in a war zone is usually bad attention. But a small fire, just big enough to warm a can of beans, just bright enough to remind you that humans discovered fire for good reasons. Heating your dinner doesn't make it taste better exactly, but it makes it taste more like food and less like military experiment. Heat is transformation. Heat is the difference between subsistence and sustenance. You sit in a rough circle with whoever's nearby. Your rifle is always within reach because dinner doesn't stop wars, but there's something almost normal about sharing a meal with other people. It's an echo of civilian life, a reminder that eating is supposed to be social. The conversations are always the same and always different. Someone talks about their mother's cooking. Someone else describes the best meal they ever had. A third person fantasizes about steaks or ice cream or fresh fruit. These aren't just conversations. They're acts of resistance. They're proof that military rations haven't completely destroyed your ability to remember what good food tastes like. Some soldiers trade items. Cheese for crackers, cigarettes for chocolate, anything to avoid that one food that turned their soul inside out. The ham and eggs is a popular trauma. Nobody likes the ham and eggs. Everyone has to eat the ham and eggs sometimes. It's a shared burden, a common enemy. The trading is serious business. You learn what everyone likes, what everyone hates, what everyone's willing to sacrifice for a slightly better meal. The economy of military dining is complex and personal. Your cigarettes might be someone else's treasure. Someone else's chocolate might be your salvation. You finish your meal with a cigarette or a stick of gum or both. You stare into the dark. You get ready to sleep with a stomach that's full of calories but empty of joy. The cigarette is important. It's the punctuation mark at the end of the meal. The signal that this brief interlude of sitting still and consuming calories is over. It's also a moment of small luxury. A few minutes when you're doing something just because you want to, not because military necessity demands it. The darkness settles around you like a familiar blanket. You can hear other soldiers finishing their own dinners, cleaning their gear, preparing for whatever the night might bring. The sounds are comforting in their familiarity. Everyone's doing the same things, facing the same challenges, making the same accommodations to circumstances beyond their control. The cycle continues, and you repeat. Tomorrow will look the same, unless it doesn't, because war is funny like that. You fall asleep thinking about food. Real food. Food that someone made because they wanted you to enjoy it, not because they needed to keep you alive long enough to be useful. You dream about your mother's kitchen, or your favorite restaurant, or that perfect sandwich you had once before everything changed. Sometimes you dream about the K-rations too. Nightmares where you're trapped in an endless cycle of opening cardboard boxes filled with the same disappointing tins. You wake up tasting phantom ham and eggs, and for a moment you can't tell if you're asleep or awake. The next day starts exactly like the last one. Same wake-up routine, same cardboard breakfast, same march through a landscape that's been rearranged by violence. Your body has adapted to the routine. Your stomach has learned not to expect much. Your taste buds have gone into a kind of hibernation, conserving their energy for better times. But you're still human. You still remember what good food tastes like. You still dream about meals that are experiences rather than obligations. You still trade your crackers for someone else's chocolate. Still save the best parts for last. Still find small moments of pleasure in the simple act of eating something sweet. Because in World War II, eating wasn't about taste. It was about survival. And maybe, just maybe, about finding comfort in the tiny rituals that reminded you you were still human. Even if your cheese wasn't, the war would end eventually. You would go home eventually. You would eat real food again eventually. But you would never forget the taste of military rations, or the particular hunger that comes from eating enough calories to survive, but not enough flavor to live. And sometimes, years later, you would catch yourself being grateful for a simple meal prepared with care by someone who wanted you to enjoy it. Because you would remember what it felt like to eat food that was designed for endurance rather than pleasure. That memory would make every civilian meal taste like a small miracle. The darker side, disease, starvation, and why the chocolate fought back the uncomfortable truth. Let's be honest, it's easy to romanticize history from a warm bed. But the truth? A lot of soldiers weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting their lunch. Because food in World War II wasn't just uninspired, it was sometimes actively hostile. Picture this. You're 18 years old, probably hungry since you were 16, and suddenly you're responsible for feeding yourself with provisions that come in packages designed by people who have clearly never eaten food. The instructions are vague, the contents are suspicious, and the expiration dates are more like gentle suggestions than actual warnings. This isn't the part of war they put in the movies. Nobody makes documentaries about soldiers doubled over with stomach cramps, wondering if that tinned meat was supposed to be that color. There are no heroic montages of young men learning to identify which mushrooms won't kill them, or mastering the delicate art of eating around mold. But this was reality for millions of soldiers. Their enemy wasn't just the opposing army, it was also their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes all three at once. The microbial front. Let's start with the obvious, disease. When your meals come in tins older than your commanding officer, stored in trucks bouncing over muddy roads, and opened with knives that also cleaned rifles, things get dicey. Literally, the food supply chain in wartime was a logistical nightmare that would make modern food safety inspectors weep into their clipboards. Imagine trying to keep food fresh when it has to travel by ship, truck, plane, and sometimes mule through climates ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat. Then imagine opening that food with whatever sharp object you happen to have, eating it with unwashed hands, and hoping for the best. Hygiene was theoretical, clean water was precious. Refrigeration was non-existent, and sterilization was something that happened to medical equipment, not dinner plates. Dysentery, food poisoning, and something vaguely called gut rot were just part of the culinary package. One soldier described his unit's rations as high in iron, mostly from the can. Dysentery was particularly brutal. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was debilitating. Soldiers would be laid out for days, unable to fight, unable to march, sometimes unable to do much more than curl up in a ball and hope their insides would eventually forgive them. In a war where every able body counted, Having half your unit incapacitated by bad beef was a strategic disaster. The symptoms were horrific and undignified. You'd be fine one moment, then doubled over the next, your body rejecting everything you'd eaten in the past week. Sometimes it felt like your stomach was trying to turn itself inside out. Sometimes you wished it would just get it over with. And the smell, dear God, the smell. When an entire unit comes down with food poisoning at the same time, in close quarters, with limited washing facilities, the situation becomes less military unit and more biological warfare experiment gone wrong. Food poisoning was democracy in action. It didn't care about your rank, your experience, or your importance to the war effort. Generals and privates suffered equally. The only difference was that generals got to suffer in slightly better accommodations. The art of dangerous cooking. You'd think cooking would help, and it did, sometimes. But in the middle of a frozen forest or a Pacific jungle, fire wasn't always an option. Nor were clean hands. Nor was knowing what animal the meat even came from. Cooking in a war zone was its own special challenge. You needed heat, but not too much heat, because smoke could give away your position. You needed time, but not too much time, because you might have to move suddenly. You needed clean utensils, but you only had whatever was in your pack, and your pack had been through things that would make a dishwasher cry. So soldiers learned to improvise. They'd heat their rations over tiny fires made from whatever would burn quietly. They'd use their helmet as a cooking pot, their bayonet as a stirring spoon, and their sleeve as a pot holder. They'd cook over candles, over cigarette lighters, over the engine block of a Jeep if they could get away with it. Sometimes the cooking worked. Sometimes the food was actually improved by being heated, becoming something that resembled real food rather than military science experiment. But sometimes the cooking just made things worse. Sometimes heating up mystery meat just made it mysteriously worse. And then there was the question of what you were actually cooking. The labels on military rations were optimistic at best. Meat could mean anything from beef to something that had once been near a cow. Chicken was sometimes recognizable as poultry, sometimes not recognizable as anything that had ever been alive. One soldier described opening a can labeled pork to find something that looked like wet cardboard and smelled like regret. He cooked it anyway, because calories were calories, but he never quite got over the experience. The geography of hunger. Then there was starvation, especially on the Eastern Front and in the Pacific. For Soviet and Japanese troops, meals weren't bad. They were gone. Starvation wasn't universal, but it was common enough to be a legitimate military strategy. Cut off the enemy's supply lines, and you didn't need to defeat them in battle. You just needed to wait for them to get too weak to fight. The Eastern Front was particularly brutal. The fighting was vicious. The weather was unforgiving, and the supply lines were constantly under attack. Soldiers on both sides would go days without proper food, subsisting on whatever they could find, steal or improvise. Soviet soldiers often lived on black bread, cabbage soup, and pure stubbornness. If they were lucky, a bit of salted fish. If not, boiled grass. Yes, boiled grass. And no, it did not taste like spinach. The bread wasn't really bread in any civilian sense. It was a dark, dense substance that was part grain, part sawdust, and part hope. It was filling, technically, and it contained nutrients, theoretically. But it had the texture of wet sand and the flavor of despair. Cabbage soup was a staple, but calling it soup was generous. It was usually hot water with a few cabbage leaves floating in it, maybe some potato peels if they were feeling fancy. Sometimes there would be a piece of meat so small you weren't sure if it was intentional or just a mistake. When even the grass ran out, soldiers would eat bark. Tree bark. They'd scrape it off trees, boil it until it was soft enough to chew, and pretend it was food. It wasn't nutritious, but it was something to put in your stomach, something to convince your body that you were still trying to feed it. Pacific Nightmare's Japanese soldiers? Rice, pickled plums, maybe dried fish if they were really blessed by the emperor that day. But in places like Guadalcanal, Supplies rotted before they arrived. Rats did better than humans, and no one wants to lose a weight loss competition to a rat. The Pacific Theater had its own special challenges. The heat was brutal, the humidity was worse, and everything rotted. Food that might have lasted weeks in a temperate climate would spoil in days in the tropical heat. Supplies that were fresh when they left the ship would be green with mold by the time they reached the front lines. Rice was supposed to be the foundation of the Japanese military diet. It was portable, nutritious, and familiar, but rice needs to stay dry, and staying dry in the Pacific was nearly impossible. Wet rice became moldy rice. Moldy rice became poisonous rice. Poisonous rice became no rice at all. The pickled plums were supposed to last longer, but even they had their limits. They'd turn black and slimy in the heat, developing textures that were disturbing even by military food standards. Soldiers would eat them anyway, because something that used to be food was better than nothing at all. Dried fish was a luxury when it was available, but it attracted insects like a magnet. You'd open your ration to find it crawling with things that had more protein than the fish itself. Some soldiers learned to appreciate the extra nutrition. Others just learned to eat in the dark. The rats really did do better than the humans. They were smaller, more adaptable, and better at finding food in impossible places. They'd get fat while the soldiers got thin, which was its own special kind of insult. The art of desperate foraging. Some soldiers became experts at foraging. Others weren't so lucky. There are grim stories. Stories about leather boots becoming stew, about tree bark as salad, and yes, whispered tales of cannibalism among the most desperate, especially during sieges. That's how bad it got. When your food makes you hallucinate, you know dinner's gone wrong. Foraging sounds romantic when you read about it in survival guides. It sounds like a useful skill, a way to live off the land, a return to humanity's hunting and gathering roots. In practice, foraging in a war zone was terrifying. First, you had to know what was safe to eat. This was harder than it sounds, especially in foreign countries where the local plants were completely unfamiliar. That mushroom might be delicious. It might also kill you. That berry might be nutritious. It might also make you violently ill at exactly the wrong moment. Second, you had to find these edible plants in areas that had been bombed, burned, and trampled by armies. Good foraging spots tend to be peaceful places. War zones are not peaceful places. The edible plants had often been destroyed along with everything else. Third, you had to forage without being shot. Standing around in the open looking for berries made you an excellent target for enemy snipers. Foraging required you to expose yourself, to move slowly and carefully, to focus on something other than staying alive. It was a luxury that most soldiers couldn't afford. The successful foragers learned to think like animals. They looked for signs of what other creatures were eating. If the birds were eating those berries, the berries were probably safe. If the rabbits were avoiding those leaves, the leaves were probably dangerous. But even successful foraging had its limits. Wild plants were usually bitter, tough, and low in calories. You could fill your stomach with dandelion greens and still be malnourished. You could eat all the berries you could find and still be hungry. Boot soup and bark bread. When foraging failed, soldiers turned to things that weren't technically food. Leather boots, when boiled long enough, would break down into something that could be chewed and swallowed. It wasn't nutritious, but it was something to do with your mouth. Something to convince your stomach that eating was still happening. The process was elaborate. You'd cut the leather into small pieces, boil it for hours until it softened, then try to choke it down. Some soldiers would add salt if they had salt. Others would add whatever herbs they could find, hoping to mask the taste of processed cowhide. It didn't work, really. Boot leather doesn't become food just because you boil it, but it gave you something to chew, something to digest, something to occupy your digestive system while you hoped for better times. Tree bark was more nutritious, surprisingly. Some types of inner bark actually contained vitamins and minerals that could keep you alive, but it was like eating wood chips. Literally, you'd scrape off the outer bark, harvest the inner bark, boil it until it was soft, and then chew it like the world's worst gum. The taste was indescribable. Imagine chewing on a pencil, but the pencil fights back. It was bitter, woody, and completely unappetizing, but it was calories, technically, and calories were life. The unthinkable. And then there were the whispered stories, the ones that soldiers didn't like to talk about, even decades later. The stories about what happened when absolutely everything else was gone. Cannibalism was rare, but it happened. Usually during sieges when soldiers were trapped with no food, no hope of resupply, and no way out. It was the ultimate breakdown of everything that made war civilized, if war could ever be called civilized. The stories are fragmentary, often secondhand, always horrible. Someone would disappear. Someone else would have meat when there shouldn't have been any meat. Questions would be asked quietly and answered even more quietly. Most soldiers never had to face this choice. Most units never got that desperate. But the fact that it happened at all, even rarely, shows just how far the breakdown of the food supply could go. These weren't monsters who did these things. They were ordinary people pushed past the breaking point of human endurance. They were soldiers who had eaten everything else. The official rations, the foraged plants, the boot leather, the tree bark, and still faced the choice between starving and surviving. The D-ration, military science gone wrong. And then, of course, there was the D-ration. Remember the chocolate bar that wasn't chocolate? The U.S. Army, in its wisdom, commissioned it to be compact, shelf-stable, and completely unappetizing, so soldiers wouldn't eat it casually. Mission accomplished. The D-ration was military efficiency taken to its logical extreme. Someone, somewhere, had looked at the problem of emergency food and decided that the solution was to create something so unpleasant that soldiers would only eat it when they were truly desperate. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate design. The army wanted a food that would keep soldiers alive but wouldn't be consumed casually. They wanted something that soldiers would save for real emergencies, not snack on during quiet moments. So they created a chocolate bar that was only technically chocolate. It contained cocoa, technically. It was sweet, sort of. It was food, legally speaking. But it was designed to be as unappetizing as possible, while still being nutritionally adequate. It looked like a chocolate bar. It was wrapped like a chocolate bar, but it had the texture of drywall and the emotional warmth of a tax audit. Biting into it could chip a tooth. Eating it cold? Dental roulette. The texture was the worst part. It wasn't just hard, it was aggressively hard. It fought back when you tried to bite it. Your teeth would slide off it like it was made of plastic. When you finally managed to break off a piece, it would sit in your mouth like a rock, slowly dissolving into something that tasted like chocolate-flavored disappointment. The temperature made it worse. In cold weather, it became harder than stone. In hot weather, it didn't melt like normal chocolate. It just became a slightly softer version of stone. There was no temperature at which it became pleasant to eat. The Chocolate Wars soldiers would shave it into hot water, hoping to soften it into something resembling cocoa. It didn't work. One GI called it a candy bar with PTSD. Another swore it was made by people who had never tasted joy or chocolate. The attempts to make it edible were creative and desperate. Soldiers would scrape it with their knives, creating chocolate shavings that they'd add to their coffee. The coffee didn't taste like mocha. It tasted like coffee with chocolate-flavored sand in it. Some soldiers would try to melt it over their tiny cooking fires. This was dangerous for multiple reasons. First, the chocolate would burn rather than melt, creating smoke that smelled like someone had set a candy factory on fire. Second, the burned chocolate would stick to whatever they were using as a pot, creating a mess that was harder to clean than their rifles. Others would try to dissolve it in alcohol when alcohol was available. This created a drink that tasted like chocolate-flavored punishment. It was probably more effective as a solvent than as a beverage. The most successful technique was the slow dissolution method. You'd put a piece in your mouth and just wait for 20 minutes, maybe 30. you'd have this hard lump of chocolate-like substance slowly dissolving on your tongue. It was like eating a very slow, very disappointing piece of candy. But even this technique had its drawbacks. Your mouth would get tired from holding the chocolate. Your jaw would ache from unconsciously trying to chew something that couldn't be chewed. And the flavor, what little flavor there was, would coat your mouth for hours afterward. The psychology of emergency food, and yet it was meant to save lives. It was packed with calories, fat, and just enough bitterness to make you reconsider all your life choices. In extreme conditions, it might have kept you going, just without smiling. The D-ration represented a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. The designers thought that making food unpleasant would prevent waste. They thought that soldiers would appreciate having emergency calories available, even if those calories came in the form of militant chocolate. They were wrong about the psychology, but right about the nutrition. The D-ration was calorie-dense and nutrient-rich. It contained enough energy to keep a soldier going for hours, maybe days if rationed carefully. It was designed to provide quick energy in desperate situations. But the psychological effect was often the opposite of what was intended. Instead of feeling grateful for emergency nutrition, soldiers felt punished. Instead of feeling prepared for emergencies, they felt like their own military was trying to poison them. The D-ration became a symbol of everything that was wrong with military food. It represented the triumph of logistics over humanity, efficiency over pleasure, survival over sanity. It was food designed by people who had forgotten that eating was supposed to be one of life's simple pleasures. The broader philosophy of military nutrition. The D-ration was part of a larger philosophy that treated soldiers as machines that needed fuel, rather than human beings who needed food. This philosophy pervaded military nutrition throughout the war. Food was seen as a logistical problem to be solved, not a human experience to be preserved. This made sense from a certain perspective. Wars are won by armies that can stay in the field longer than their enemies. Armies that can maintain their fighting strength while their enemies weaken from hunger have a massive advantage. Food is a weapon, and armies that can feed their soldiers have better weapons than armies that can't. But this perspective ignored the psychological and emotional aspects of eating. Food isn't just fuel. It's comfort, culture, identity, and pleasure. When you strip away everything that makes food human, you strip away part of what makes soldiers human. The result was food that kept soldiers alive but made them miserable. Rations that provided adequate nutrition but destroyed morale. Meals that solved the logistical problem of feeding armies while creating new problems of depression, digestive distress, and sheer culinary despair. The long-term effects. And that's the darker side of eating in war. It wasn't just bland. It wasn't just boring. Sometimes it was terrifying. The effects of military food extended far beyond the war itself. Soldiers would return home with damaged digestive systems, having spent years eating food that their bodies barely tolerated. They'd have post-traumatic stress about certain textures, certain smells, certain flavors that reminded them of the worst meals of their lives. Some veterans would never be able to eat Spam again. Others would have panic attacks at the smell of canned meat. The most unfortunate would associate chocolate with the D-ration, ruining one of life's simple pleasures for decades to come. The psychological scars were subtler but equally real. These men had spent years in an environment where food was unreliable, unpleasant, and sometimes dangerous. They'd learned not to trust their meals, not to expect pleasure from eating, not to take adequate nutrition for granted. Coming home meant relearning how to eat. It meant discovering that food could be enjoyable again, that meals could be social again, that eating could be something other than a grim necessity. For some veterans, this transition was easy. For others, it took years. The families of returning soldiers often noticed the changes. Their sons, husbands, and fathers would eat quickly without really tasting their food. They'd hoard canned goods, keeping emergency supplies long after the emergency was over. They'd be suspicious of new foods, preferring the familiar even when the familiar was unpleasant. The lasting legacy. Because when you're thousands of miles from home, cold, hungry, and tired, your dinner isn't just a meal. It's a threat, a gamble, and if you're lucky, only mildly explosive. The food of World War II taught an entire generation that eating could be dangerous, that meals could be weapons, that the simple act of consuming calories could be an act of courage. These weren't lessons that anyone wanted to learn, but they were lessons that couldn't be unlearned. In the decades after the war, military nutrition would improve dramatically. The lessons learned from dysentery outbreaks, vitamin deficiencies, and chocolate bar failures would lead to better rations, safer food handling, and more attention to the psychological aspects of eating. But for the soldiers who lived through it, the damage was done. They'd eaten their way through hell and come out the other side with a profound appreciation for food that tasted good, meals that were safe, and the simple luxury of being able to choose what to eat. The D ration would eventually be replaced with better emergency foods. Military cooking would eventually become more sophisticated. Food safety would eventually become a priority rather than an afterthought. But the memory would linger. The taste of that terrible chocolate, the texture of those impossible crackers, the fear that came with opening a can of mystery meat. These memories would stay with veterans for the rest of their lives. They'd remember the darker side of military dining every time they sat down to a good meal. They'd think about their younger selves, eating terrible food in terrible places, and they'd be grateful for the simple fact that their current dinner wasn't trying to kill them. And maybe, just maybe, they'd have a moment of dark appreciation for just how much worse things could have been. 5 moments in history, how food shaped the war. You wouldn't think a tin of beans or a bag of rice could alter the course of history. But in World War II, food wasn't just a detail. It was strategy, morale, survival, and sometimes the reason people lived or didn't. So let's dim the lights a little further, settle deeper under the covers, and drift through 5 moments where what people ate or couldn't eat quietly tipped the balance. The Hershey bar that crossed the Atlantic. It's 1942. American GIs are landing in Europe, and they're not just bringing guns. They're bringing chocolate, real chocolate, the kind that melts, soothes, and reminds you of home. And the locals? They notice the sweet revolution. Picture this. You're 8 years old in a bombed-out French village. You haven't seen chocolate in 3 years. You've almost forgotten what sugar tastes like. Your breakfast was ersatz coffee made from acorns and a piece of bread so dark and dense it could be used as building material. Your lunch was whatever your mother could trade for at the black market, if she was lucky enough to find anything to trade. Then this tall American soldier walks up to you. He's got clean clothes, which is remarkable enough. He's got all his teeth, which is almost miraculous. And he reaches into his pocket and pulls out something wrapped in brown paper that smells like possibility. To a child in war-torn France or Belgium, an American soldier handing over a Hershey bar wasn't just offering candy. He was offering a taste of safety, of life before the bombs, of hope. The first bite was revelation. Sweet, rich, smooth. Everything that had been missing from the world for so long you'd started to believe it might never come back. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, you weren't a war orphan scraping by in the ruins of civilization. You were just a kid eating chocolate. The economics of sweetness. The Hershey Company had been preparing for war since 1937, 5 years before America even entered the conflict. They knew that chocolate would be more than just a morale booster. It would be a diplomatic tool, a currency, and a symbol of American prosperity. The military had specific requirements for their chocolate. It had to survive tropical heat without melting completely. It had to remain edible in Arctic cold without becoming so hard it broke teeth. It had to be nutritious enough to serve as emergency rations. And it had to taste good enough that soldiers would actually want to eat it. this was harder than it sounds. Regular chocolate melts at around 86 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above normal body temperature. In the Pacific Theater, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees, normal chocolate would turn into brown soup. In the European winter, it would become chocolate-flavored rock. Hershey's solution was ingenious. They developed a special heat-resistant chocolate that wouldn't melt until it reached 120 degrees. It didn't taste quite like regular chocolate. It was a little grittier, a little less smooth, but it was recognizably chocolate, and that was what mattered. They also created special packaging. Each bar was wrapped in foil, then wrapped again in wax paper, then packed in specially designed boxes that could withstand being dropped from airplanes, bounced around in the backs of trucks, and carried in soldiers' pockets for weeks at a time. The production miracle. The scale of chocolate production during the war was staggering. Hershey was producing over 24 million chocolate bars per week at the height of the war. That's more than 1.2 billion bars per year, enough to give every American soldier overseas 3 bars per week. But it wasn't just about quantity, it was about consistency. Every bar had to be exactly the same size, exactly the same weight, exactly the same nutritional content. The military didn't want soldiers trading bars because some were bigger than others. They wanted a standardized unit of sweetness. The Hershey factories became military industrial complexes. They ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers were classified as essential personnel, exempt from the draft because their work was considered crucial to the war effort, and it was. Chocolate was classified as a strategic material, as important to military operations as steel or rubber. The factories were retooled for wartime production. Normal candy production was suspended. All the machinery was dedicated to making military chocolate. Even the famous Hershey's Kisses were discontinued for the duration of the war. All that production capacity was needed for military bars. The logistics of joy, getting chocolate to soldiers, wasn't just a matter of production. It was a logistical challenge that required coordination between factories, shipping companies, military transport, and supply sergeants scattered across 6 continents. The chocolate had to survive ocean crossings that could take weeks. It had to be loaded and unloaded multiple times, often under fire. It had to be distributed to units that were constantly moving, often behind enemy lines, sometimes cut off from regular supply routes. The military developed special protocols for chocolate distribution. It was classified as a Class A supply, the same category as ammunition and medical supplies. Units were required to maintain minimum chocolate reserves. Soldiers who lost or traded their chocolate could face disciplinary action. But the real challenge wasn't getting chocolate to American soldiers. It was deciding what to do with the excess. Because there was always excess. The military had overproduced, planning for casualties and equipment losses that, thankfully, were lower than expected. The diplomatic candy. This is where the chocolate became something more than just military rations. American commanders, from generals down to squad leaders, were encouraged to share chocolate with local civilians. It wasn't official policy. Officially, military supplies were for military personnel only, but it was understood policy. Everybody knew that a Hershey bar could buy more goodwill than 1,000 propaganda leaflets. The chocolate became currency in the informal economy that springs up around any military occupation. A Hershey bar could buy information about enemy movements. It could purchase safe passage through hostile territory. It could turn a suspicious civilian into an ally, at least temporarily. Children were particularly susceptible to chocolate diplomacy. A kid who received a Hershey bar from an American soldier would remember that soldier, and by extension America itself, for the rest of his life. That 8-year-old French boy would grow up to be a 40-year-old French businessman who had positive feelings about America, all because of a moment of sweetness in the middle of a war. The ripple effects. The psychological impact of American chocolate extended far beyond the immediate recipients. Word spread quickly through bombed-out villages and occupied towns. The Americans have chocolate, real chocolate, and they share it. This created a powerful contrast with the German occupiers, who had been steadily requisitioning food from occupied territories since the beginning of the war. German soldiers weren't handing out treats to local children. They were taking food away from local families to feed the German war machine. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have so much food that they could afford to give away luxuries. This sent a powerful message about American industrial capacity, American wealth, and American generosity. It suggested that America was winning the war not just militarily, but economically. European civilians who had been living under rationing for years were amazed by the casual abundance of American supplies. American soldiers threw away food that European families would have treasured. They complained about rations that were better than what most civilians had eaten in months. The cultural exchange. The chocolate also created opportunities for cultural exchange that wouldn't have existed otherwise. A shared Hershey bar became an excuse for conversation. American soldiers would try to communicate with local children using gestures, broken foreign language phrases, and the universal language of chocolate. These interactions humanized both sides. The children saw that American soldiers were young men, often barely adults themselves, far from home and missing their own families. The soldiers saw that the locals were real people with real lives, not just abstract concepts in a geopolitical struggle. Some soldiers started learning local languages specifically so they could talk to the children they gave chocolate to. Others began carrying extra bars specifically for distribution, using their own money to buy additional chocolate from the PX when their official rations ran out. The relationships formed over shared chocolate sometimes lasted long after the war ended. Soldiers would correspond with families they had met, sending care packages that always included chocolate. Some would return to Europe as tourists, looking up the children they had befriended, often finding that those children had named their own children after the American soldiers who had shared chocolate with them. The economic impact. The presence of American chocolate in European markets had broader economic implications that extended well beyond the immediate wartime period. The chocolate created demand for American products that would continue after the war ended. European chocolate manufacturers, many of which had been destroyed or converted to military production during the war, faced the challenge of competing with American products that had become familiar and trusted during the occupation. Hershey's had essentially had 4 years of free market research, learning European tastes and preferences through direct distribution. The American chocolate also established pricing expectations. Europeans, who had become accustomed to receiving chocolate as gifts from American soldiers, had difficulty adjusting to paying full price for domestic chocolate after the war. This created market opportunities for American confectionery companies that lasted well into the 1950s. The home front connection. Back in America, the knowledge that their chocolate was being used as a diplomatic tool gave civilians a sense of participation in the war effort. Parents could imagine their sons sharing Hershey bars with foreign children. Wives could picture their husbands using chocolate to build friendships with allies. This created a positive feedback loop. Civilian support for chocolate production increased because people understood that chocolate was doing more than just feeding soldiers. It was representing America to the world. This support made it easier to maintain the industrial capacity needed for large-scale chocolate production throughout the war. The Hershey Company capitalized on this connection through advertising that emphasized the patriotic duty of chocolate consumption. Buying chocolate wasn't just satisfying a sweet tooth. It was supporting the troops and representing American values abroad. The opposition response. The Germans and their allies quickly recognized the propaganda value of American chocolate and attempted to counteract it through their own food distribution programs. German soldiers were instructed to share food with local populations when possible, but they simply didn't have the surplus capacity that allowed Americans to be generous. German propaganda attempted to portray American chocolate distribution as a form of cultural imperialism, an attempt to buy loyalty rather than earn it through legitimate means. But this message had limited effectiveness, particularly with children who weren't interested in geopolitical theory when faced with actual chocolate. The Japanese attempted similar programs in their occupied territories, but they faced even greater resource constraints than the Germans. Japanese soldiers were often on reduced rations themselves, making food sharing impossible. When they did attempt to distribute food to civilians, it was usually rice-based and lacked the immediate appeal of chocolate. The scientific aspect. The success of American chocolate diplomacy wasn't just due to the appeal of sugar and cocoa. There was actual science behind why chocolate was such an effective tool for building relationships and improving morale. Chocolate contains compounds that trigger the release of endorphins in the brain, the same chemicals that create feelings of happiness and well-being. It also contains small amounts of caffeine and theobromine, mild stimulants that increase alertness and energy. For people who had been living under the stress of war for years, chocolate provided actual neurochemical relief. The ritual of sharing food also triggers deep psychological responses that extend back to humanity's earliest social behaviors. Sharing food creates bonds of trust and reciprocity that go beyond the immediate transaction. When an American soldier shared chocolate with a local child, he was participating in one of humanity's most fundamental social rituals. The long-term legacy. It wasn't in any battle plan, but it mattered. That little brown rectangle did more for us. Image building than 1,000 pamphlets. The chocolate diplomacy of World War II established patterns of American soft power that would continue throughout the Cold War and beyond. The idea that America could win friends through abundance rather than force became a cornerstone of American foreign policy. The program also established Hershey's as an international brand with global recognition. The company leveraged its wartime distribution network to establish permanent operations in Europe and Asia after the war ended. Markets that had been opened by military chocolate distribution became the foundation for civilian sales that continued for decades. Perhaps most importantly, the chocolate program demonstrated that small gestures could have large consequences. A Hershey bar that cost a few cents to produce could create goodwill that lasted for generations. In a world where military solutions were measured in billions of dollars and millions of casualties, the chocolate program offered proof that sometimes the simplest approaches were the most effective. The personal stories. The real impact of American chocolate can only be understood through the personal stories of the people who received it. There's the story of Marie Claire, a 7-year-old girl in Normandy who received her first Hershey bar on D-Day +6. She saved half of it for 3 weeks, eating a small piece each day to make it last. 60 years later, she still remembered the name of the soldier who gave it to her, Sergeant Tommy Morrison from Toledo, Ohio. There's the story of Hans, a German boy in Berlin who received chocolate from an American soldier during the occupation. His father had been killed fighting the Americans, but the chocolate helped him understand that Americans were people, not monsters. He grew up to become a diplomat, spending his career building bridges between Germany and the United States. There's the story of Giuseppe, an Italian boy who used American chocolate to barter for school supplies, eventually getting enough books to complete his education and become a teacher. He spent 40 years teaching English to Italian children, always beginning his first lesson by telling the story of the American soldier who gave him chocolate. The manufacturing marvel. The sheer scale of wartime chocolate production was unprecedented in human history. Hershey's chocolate factory in Pennsylvania became one of the largest food production facilities in the world. At peak production, the factory was consuming 100,000 pounds of sugar per day, 50,000 pounds of cocoa per day, and 200,000 pounds of milk per day. The factory employed over 15,000 workers, making it one of the largest employers in Pennsylvania. Many of these workers were women who had replaced men who had been drafted into military service. The factory operated its own training programs, teaching chocolate production techniques to workers who had never seen industrial food production before. The quality control standards were military grade. Every batch of chocolate was tested for temperature resistance, nutritional content, and flavor consistency. Batches that didn't meet specifications were rejected, even if they were perfectly edible by civilian standards. The military wanted chocolate that would perform reliably under combat conditions. The global impact, call it the original soft power, literally soft if it didn't melt first. By the end of the war, American chocolate had been distributed on every continent except Antarctica. It had been eaten by children in France, soldiers in the Philippines, resistance fighters in Yugoslavia, and prisoners of war in German camps. It had become a global symbol of American generosity and industrial capability. The chocolate program influenced post-war reconstruction efforts throughout Europe and Asia. American aid programs consistently included food distribution components, recognizing that hunger was a political problem as much as a humanitarian one. The success of wartime chocolate diplomacy demonstrated that food could be used as a tool for building stable, democratic societies. The program also established precedents for corporate involvement in foreign policy that continue to this day. The partnership between Hershey and the U.S. military became a model for how private companies would support government objectives, while also advancing their own commercial interests. The chocolate that crossed the Atlantic during World War II wasn't just candy. It was a weapon of mass construction, building relationships and creating goodwill that outlasted the war itself. It demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful tools of diplomacy come not from government bureaus or military commands, but from the simple human act of sharing something sweet with someone who needs a reason to smile. In the grand strategy of World War II, chocolate was a footnote, but in the human story of the war, it was often the main course, the moment that reminded people on both sides that they were still human, still capable of kindness, still able to find sweetness in the midst of devastation. That brown rectangle melted in the mouths of children across the world, but the memories it created were permanent, sweet, lasting, and ultimately more powerful than all the weapons that won the war. The golden years of German military cuisine. Early in the war, German rations were actually kind of amazing. Sausages, cheese, dark rye bread, basically a picnic with a helmet. Picture the Wehrmacht in 1939. They weren't just well-equipped with tanks and aircraft. They were genuinely well-fed. German military planners had learned from World War I, when poor nutrition had contributed to military collapse and civilian unrest. They were determined not to repeat those mistakes. The early German field kitchen was a marvel of efficiency and abundance. Mobile field kitchens called Gulaschkanonen, literally goulash cannons, followed troops into Poland, France, and the Low Countries. These weren't just soup kitchens on wheels. They were sophisticated cooking operations that could prepare hot meals for entire battalions. A typical German soldier's breakfast in 1940 might include thick slices of Kommissbrot, dense, dark rye bread that was both nutritious and filling. There would be real butter, not margarine, maybe some liverwurst or other spreadable meat. Coffee was actual coffee, strong and black, served in proper metal cups that retained heat. Lunch could be a proper meal, beef or pork stew with potatoes and vegetables, served hot from the field kitchen. The portions were generous. German military nutritionists calculated that soldiers needed substantial calories for the physical demands of warfare. Dinner might include more bread, cheese, perhaps some cured meat, and tea or coffee. The quality was genuinely impressive. German food science was advanced, and their military contractors were producing rations that wouldn't have been out of place in a civilian restaurant. Soldiers wrote home about eating better in the army than they had as civilians during the economic hardships of the 1930s. But this abundance contained the seeds of its own destruction. The German military was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate, drawing on stockpiles that had been built up during the pre-war years. They were eating their way through Germany's strategic reserves, confident that quick victories would allow them to replenish supplies from conquered territories. The first cracks in the system. But as the war dragged on, things changed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual decline that began as early as 1941, though most soldiers didn't notice the initial changes. The bread was still bread, the coffee was still coffee, the meat was still recognizably meat. But the portions were slightly smaller. The quality was marginally lower. The variety was subtly reduced. The first substitutions were relatively minor. Sugar became scarce, replaced by saccharin tablets that left a metallic aftertaste. White flour was mixed with darker grains, making the bread denser and less appealing. Fresh vegetables disappeared from most field kitchens, replaced by preserved or canned alternatives. By 1942, the changes were becoming harder to ignore. The mobile field kitchens were increasingly unreliable, victims of fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns. Hot meals became less frequent, replaced by cold rations that bore little resemblance to the abundant field kitchens of the early war period. The supply lines that had worked efficiently in the compact campaigns of 1939 to 1940 were now stretched across vast distances. Getting food to troops in Russia required transportation networks that were constantly under attack from partisans. The German military found itself fighting two wars simultaneously, one against enemy armies and another against its own logistical limitations. The science of substitution. Real coffee, gone, replaced by roasted acorns. Butter, say hello to ersatz margarine. A spreadable sadness. Bread, bulked out with sawdust. Yes, sawdust. The word ersatz became the defining characteristic of German wartime nutrition. It means substitute or replacement, but it carried connotations of inferiority, of making do with second-best alternatives. Ersatz products weren't designed to be good. They were designed to be adequate, to provide basic nutrition while conserving scarce resources for more critical military needs. Ersatz coffee was perhaps the most psychologically devastating substitution. Coffee had been central to German military culture, the drink that started each day and provided comfort during long, cold nights. Real coffee beans required imports from overseas territories that Germany could no longer access due to British naval blockades. The substitutes were creative but horrible. Roasted acorns were ground and brewed like coffee beans, producing a bitter brown liquid that contained no caffeine and little comfort. Chicory root was another popular substitute, slightly more palatable but equally unsatisfying. Some ersatz coffee was made from roasted grains, wheat, barley, even corn, that produced something hot and brown but bore no resemblance to actual coffee. Soldiers would spend precious time and energy trying to improve their ersatz coffee. They'd mix it with real coffee beans when available, creating a diluted but recognizable approximation of the real thing. Some would add sugar or honey when they could find it. Others would drink it cold rather than hot, reasoning that it was less offensive when you couldn't smell it. The bread crisis. The bread situation was even more dire. Bread was fundamental to German culture and military tradition. The phrase daily bread wasn't metaphorical. Bread was literally the foundation of German nutrition, the basic food that everything else was built around. Early in the war, German military bread was excellent. Dark, dense rye bread that was filling and nutritious. But as grain became scarce, bakers began experimenting with additives to extend the flour supply. At first, these were relatively benign. Potato flour, which actually improved the texture, or ground turnips, which added moisture. But as the war progressed, the additives became more desperate. Sawdust, actual wood pulp, was added to bread dough to provide bulk. It had no nutritional value and was barely digestible, but it made the bread larger and more filling, at least temporarily. Soldiers would joke grimly about eating trees for breakfast, but the reality was that sawdust bread was often all that was available. The sawdust wasn't even clean sawdust. It was often contaminated with machine oil, metal shavings, and other industrial waste. Eating sawdust bread meant consuming whatever the sawmill had been processing: pine, oak, beech, sometimes wood that had been treated with chemicals or paints. Other bread additives included ground acorn shells, which were hard and bitter, cellulose powder made from processed paper, and in desperate times, ground clay that provided bulk but no nutrition whatsoever. Some bread contained so many non-food additives that it was barely recognizable as bread at all. The protein problem meat became equally problematic. Early German military rations had included generous portions of beef, pork, and poultry, but livestock requires enormous amounts of grain and other feed, resources that Germany increasingly couldn't spare as agricultural production declined and captured territories proved less productive than expected. Ersatz meat took many forms, none of them particularly appealing. Soy protein was processed into patties that supposedly resembled beef, but had the texture of cardboard and the flavor of disappointment. Fish meal was compressed into blocks and flavored with chemical additives designed to mimic the taste of land animals. Perhaps most disturbing were the meat substitutes made from industrial byproducts. Leather scraps were processed into gelatin, then molded into shapes that vaguely resembled sausages. Blood from slaughterhouses was dried and powdered, then reconstituted into something that could be spread on bread like liverwurst. The infamous Wehrmacht sausage of the later war period contained so little actual meat that soldiers joked it should be classified as a vegetable. Analysis of captured German rations revealed sausages that were primarily grain filler, artificial flavoring, and food coloring, with just enough animal protein to justify the name. The vitamin crisis. The nutritional consequences of the ersatz diet were severe and immediate. German soldiers began suffering from deficiency diseases that had been virtually eliminated from European militaries during the 20th century. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, became common among troops who had been eating processed rations for extended periods. Their gums would bleed, their teeth would become loose, and old wounds would reopen. The traditional military remedy, fresh fruits and vegetables, was simply unavailable. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, affected soldiers whose diet consisted primarily of processed grains and ersatz products. They would develop neurological symptoms, muscle weakness, and heart problems. In severe cases, soldiers would become unable to march or fight effectively. Night blindness, caused by vitamin A deficiency, was particularly problematic for troops operating in low-light conditions. Soldiers who couldn't see properly in the dark were not just ineffective, they were dangerous to themselves and their units. The German Military Medical Corps tried to address these problems through vitamin supplements, but the supplements themselves were often ersatz products of questionable effectiveness. Vitamin C tablets made from synthesized chemicals didn't work as well as natural sources. Vitamin D supplements were inconsistent in quality and potency. The psychological impact. The mighty Wehrmacht, once powered by bratwurst, was now running on bark and regret. The psychological impact of the ersatz diet was perhaps more devastating than the nutritional consequences. German soldiers had entered the war confident in their military superiority, their technological advantages, and their cultural achievements. Being reduced to eating sawdust bread and acorn coffee was a powerful symbol of how far they had fallen. Food is deeply connected to identity and morale. German military culture had traditionally emphasized the importance of good food and proper nutrition. The decline in food quality was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Soldiers couldn't pretend that victory was imminent when their breakfast tasted like tree bark. The ersatz diet also created a sense of betrayal among troops who felt that their leadership had failed to provide adequate supplies. Soldiers, who had been promised quick victories and abundant loot, found themselves eating worse food than they had during the economic hardships of the 1930s. Letters home became increasingly focused on food complaints. Soldiers would describe their meals in detail, partly to inform their families about their conditions, but partly as a form of protest against the deteriorating situation. Families began sending care packages focused on basic foodstuffs, real coffee, sugar, canned meat, that soldiers treasured more than military decorations. The foraging economy. As official rations became increasingly inadequate, German soldiers developed elaborate systems for supplementing their diet through foraging, trading, and requisitioning from local populations. Foraging required extensive knowledge of local plants and animals, knowledge that most German soldiers lacked when fighting in foreign territories. Eastern European forests contained edible plants that were completely unfamiliar to soldiers from Bavaria or Prussia. What looked edible might be poisonous. What looked poisonous might be nutritious. Some units developed foraging expertise through trial and error, often with tragic consequences. Soldiers would experiment with local berries, mushrooms, and roots, sometimes discovering new food sources, sometimes poisoning themselves. The medical corps treated numerous cases of food poisoning from soldiers who had eaten the wrong plants. Trading with local populations was officially forbidden but practically essential. German soldiers would trade cigarettes, ammunition, or personal items for fresh bread, vegetables, or meat. These transactions were risky. Soldiers could be court-martialed for unauthorized trading. But they were often the difference between adequate nutrition and starvation. The home front connection. The ersatz diet wasn't limited to military personnel. Civilian populations in Germany were experiencing similar shortages and substitutions, creating a shared sense of deprivation that extended across the entire society. German civilians were eating the same sawdust bread, drinking the same acorn coffee, and consuming the same ersatz meat products. This created a strange form of solidarity between the home front and the military front. Everyone was suffering together, making do with inferior substitutes, learning to find satisfaction in foods that would have been rejected as animal feed before the war. But it also meant that there was no refuge from the ersatz diet. Soldiers on leave couldn't return home to good food and civilian comforts. Home cooking was just as artificial and unsatisfying as military rations. Families couldn't send care packages filled with real food because real food wasn't available on the civilian market either. The industrial dimension. The production of ersatz foods became a major industrial undertaking, requiring the development of new technologies and manufacturing processes. German chemical companies invested heavily in synthetic food production, creating artificial flavors, synthetic vitamins, and processed protein substitutes. Some of these innovations were genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint. German chemists developed methods for extracting protein from sources that had never been considered food: wood pulp, petroleum byproducts, even human hair collected from barbershops. These proteins could be processed into products that resembled traditional foods, at least superficially, but the industrial capacity required for ersatz food production diverted resources from military equipment manufacturing. Factories that could have been producing ammunition or aircraft parts were instead grinding acorns and processing sawdust. The ersatz food program became a perfect example of the economic contradictions that undermined the German war effort. The regional variations. Different theaters of war experienced different versions of the ersatz diet, depending on local conditions and supply line accessibility. Troops in Western Europe generally fared better than those in Eastern Europe, where distances were greater and partisan activity more disruptive. German troops in North Africa faced unique challenges related to heat and spoilage. Foods that might have remained edible in European climates became rancid within hours in the desert heat. Ersatz products that were barely palatable under normal conditions became completely inedible when exposed to extreme temperatures. Eastern Front troops experienced the most severe food shortages, partly due to distance from supply bases, but also because of deliberate Soviet tactics designed to deny German forces access to local food sources. Soviet forces would destroy crops, livestock, and food storage facilities rather than allow them to fall into German hands. The medical consequences: one soldier said his sandwich tasted like defeat, and that was before they started losing. German military medical records from the later war period document a dramatic increase in nutrition-related health problems. Digestive disorders became epidemic among troops eating ersatz foods. The human digestive system simply wasn't designed to process sawdust, cellulose, and industrial byproducts. Chronic diarrhea was common among soldiers whose diet consisted primarily of ersatz products. Their bodies couldn't properly digest the artificial ingredients, leading to malnutrition even when caloric intake was technically adequate. Soldiers would consume thousands of calories per day but still lose weight because their bodies couldn't extract nutrients from the ersatz foods. Dental problems were equally severe. Sawdust bread was abrasive enough to wear down tooth enamel. Ersatz coffee was acidic enough to cause tooth decay. Many soldiers developed serious dental problems that affected their ability to eat even the limited food that was available. The morale crisis: the ersatz diet contributed to a broader morale crisis that affected German military effectiveness throughout the later stages of the war. Soldiers who couldn't trust their food couldn't trust their leadership. Troops who were eating sawdust bread had good reason to question the competence and honesty of their commanders. Food complaints became a form of passive resistance. Soldiers would deliberately exaggerate the awfulness of their rations, turning mealtimes into group therapy sessions where everyone could voice their dissatisfaction with the war effort. These conversations were technically treasonous, but they were so universal that military police couldn't prosecute everyone. The contrast with earlier war periods was stark and undeniable. Veterans of the 1940 campaigns could remember when German rations had been genuinely good. They had personal experience of what German military logistics could accomplish under ideal conditions. The decline to ersatz products was impossible to rationalize as anything other than failure. The comparison problem: German soldiers were also increasingly aware of how their rations compared to those of their enemies. Captured Allied food was revelatory. American K rations, while not gourmet meals, were incomparably better than German ersatz products. Soviet rations, even at their worst, at least contained recognizable ingredients. This comparison was psychologically devastating. German soldiers had been told that they were the master race, destined to rule over inferior peoples. But inferior peoples were eating better food than the supposedly superior Germans. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Stories about Allied food quality spread through German units with the speed of wildfire. Soldiers who had participated in raids on American supply depots would return with tales of abundant chocolate, real coffee, and canned meat that actually contained meat. These stories were both inspiring, proof that good food still existed somewhere, and demoralizing, evidence of how far German capabilities had declined. The long-term effects: the ersatz diet had lasting effects on German soldiers that extended well beyond the end of the war. Many veterans developed permanent digestive problems from years of eating artificial foods. Others developed psychological aversions to certain textures and flavors that reminded them of ersatz products. Post-war German food culture was shaped by memories of ersatz products. The abundance of the 1950s economic miracle was partly a reaction against the deprivations of the war years. Germans who had eaten sawdust bread developed an almost obsessive appreciation for real bread, real coffee, and authentic ingredients. The word ersatz itself became a permanent part of the German language, but with connotations that extended far beyond food. Anything artificial, inferior, or inadequate could be described as ersatz. The term became a shorthand for the broader failures of the Nazi regime. Promises that weren't kept, solutions that didn't work, substitutes that satisfied no one. The industrial legacy, some of the technologies developed for ersatz food production had peaceful applications after the war. Methods for extracting protein from unconventional sources contributed to the development of modern processed foods. Artificial flavoring techniques pioneered during the war became the foundation for post-war food manufacturing. But the ersatz program also demonstrated the limitations of technological solutions to fundamental resource problems. No amount of chemical innovation could replace the basic agricultural and logistical requirements for feeding large populations. The ersatz diet was a testament to German scientific ingenuity, but also proof that science alone couldn't overcome strategic miscalculations. The cultural memory. The ersatz diet became a central part of German collective memory about World War II. Unlike military defeats or political failures, food experiences were personal and universal. Every German who lived through the war had their own memories of ersatz coffee, sawdust bread, and artificial meat. These memories shaped post-war German attitudes toward food, technology, and government promises. Germans became skeptical of artificial products and suspicious of claims about technological solutions to basic human needs. The ersatz experience created a cultural preference for authentic, traditional foods that persisted for generations. The irony was profound. A regime that had promised abundance and prosperity had reduced its supporters to eating tree bark and sawdust. The master race had been defeated not just militarily but culinarily. They had been reduced to a diet that was literally indigestible, a perfect metaphor for an ideology that had proven equally impossible to swallow. By the end of the war, German soldiers were eating products that barely qualified as food, surviving on substitutes that substituted for nothing, drinking coffee that contained no coffee, and eating bread that contained no grain. The ersatz diet had become ersatz nutrition, providing calories without nourishment, bulk without satisfaction, meals without meaning. The mighty Wehrmacht, which had begun the war feasting on the abundance of German industrial capacity, ended it scraping the bottom of every barrel, grinding every acorn, processing every piece of sawdust into something that could theoretically be consumed by human beings who had no other choice. It was a perfect symbol of Nazi Germany itself, impressive on the surface, hollow at the core, ultimately unsustainable and fundamentally artificial. The ersatz diet was ersatz civilization, a substitute for actual human society that satisfied no one and nourished nothing, leaving everyone who consumed it hungry for something real. So here you are, warm, fed, hopefully horizontal. Maybe your stomach's full. Maybe your thoughts are slowing. Maybe you're just now realizing how lucky you are not to be eating powdered eggs with a knife. We've wandered through foxholes, mess kits, and ration tins, through meals that tried to kill you and chocolate that tasted like sadness. We saw how soldiers faced bullets, boredom, and beans, often all in the same afternoon, and somehow they endured. With humor, with creativity, with whatever was in their tin that day, because food in World War II wasn't a comfort. It was survival, and maybe sometimes a strange little reminder that they were still human. So the next time your toast is a bit too brown, or your coffee's gone cold, think about a soldier crouched in the mud, chewing a chocolate bar designed by science to taste bad on purpose. And be grateful. Grateful for warm blankets, for fresh fruit, for food that doesn't come with a cigarette and a single sheet of toilet paper. You're not in a trench tonight. You're not boiling water in a helmet. You're not swapping socks for jam. You're here, and you're safe, and maybe, just maybe, ready to sleep. So go ahead. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts drift somewhere far from powdered milk and canned meat. And if you dream of war rations tonight, let them at least come with seasoning. Sleep well, friend, and may your next chocolate bar melt just a little.